back to show you how to make biscuits. So this is Miss Estes. Come and cook along with me. Today we're going to be using these ingredients: milk, shortening, all-purpose flour, baking powder as our leavening agent, salt, and a little bit of sugar. Here are our cast of equipment. The first step in making our biscuits is going to be to measure the flour. So today we're using all-purpose flour. There are many recipes that will call for different types. Some call for self-rising, so make sure you're looking at your recipe and you're reading it correctly. I'm going to stir this to sort of aerate it and break up any clumps. Then I'm going to take my spoon and I'm going to spoon it into my measuring cup till it's heaping over. And I'm going to take the back of my spoon and level it off so that I have an exact measure. So there's 1 cup of flour. There's our 2nd cup of flour. I'm going to be using my flour in just a moment, so I'm going to set it aside. The next thing I'm going to measure is going to be my sugar. So I need 1 tablespoon of sugar. It's okay to shake that because it's granulated sugar and it won't settle or pack. So you'll notice as I measure my ingredients, I'm moving them from one side to the next. That's going to ensure that I don't forget something. I also needed a tablespoon of baking powder. Baking powder is our leavening agent. One thing that's handy about baking powder is it has a straight edge on most cans so that you can level it off directly using the can. Baking powder has an acid and a base. So when it's mixed with a liquid, it will have a reaction. It's also usually double acting. So the first time it's mixed with liquid, it has a bubbling action, and then the second time is when it's in contact with heat. It will have a second reaction. Another leavening agent we have is baking soda. We're not using it today, but baking soda is a base only. So it must be paired with an acid, whereas baking powder is both an acid and a base. So if I were going to use baking soda in a recipe, I would be on the lookout for an ingredient that is acidic. Some of those ingredients may be things like buttermilk. Buttermilk has acid. Paired with baking soda, it will cause that leavening agent and your product will rise. Next up, I'm going to measure 1 teaspoon of salt. I'm adding salt and I'm adding the leavening agent because, again, I chose to use all-purpose flour instead of self-rising flour. So now those ingredients are in my mixing bowl. I'm going to take my spoon and I'm going to stir them up. Many recipes call for you to sift these ingredients together. I'm going to skip that step by just using a spoon to make sure that they are mixed up thoroughly and there are no lumps, and I've aerated my flour this way. My next ingredient I'm going to measure is going to be my shortening. So this particular recipe calls for shortening. Many other recipes may call for lard or they may call for butter. So I'm going to spoon my shortening in and I'm going to use the back of my spoon to press down and level it out. And I'm ready to add my shortening. I'm going to spoon that into my flour and I'm going to use my pastry blending tool and I'm going to cut the shortening into the flour. This is the same technique you use when you are making pastries. So if you were making a pie crust, you would also be using flour, you would be using some sort of fat, and you would be using a pastry blender to cut your fat into your flour. If I were going to be making a pastry, I would leave some of my fat pieces a little bit larger because that's going to ensure that I have a nice flaky pastry. But because I'm making biscuits today, I'm going to cut my fat into sized pieces that are about the size of a small pea or coarse cornmeal. So I'm going to continue for just a few more seconds. To check it, I'm going to use my hands. So I'm looking for the fat size pieces I have. And most of those are fairly small, no larger than a small pea, so I know I have the correct size. Next, I'm ready to measure my milk. So I'm going to use my liquid measuring cup. I'm going to pour my milk in, and when you measure liquids, You always bend down to eye level to make sure you have a correct measurement on your milk. An important step here is to note sometimes the humidity comes into play when you're making quick breads and when you're making biscuits and pastries and other types of things. So you may not need all of the liquid. So I'm going to pour into a well. I'm going to pour about 3/4 of my milk in, reserving some just in case there's moisture in my air and I may not truly need all of that milk. I'm going to stir it with my fork till it starts to come together into a ball and leaves the sides of the bowl. This is coming together. I can tell it's still moist, and I know that my hands will be able to bring it together. So I'm not going to need to add all of my milk. If I were to add all of my milk, I may end up with a gummy, sticky product when I would have to add more flour, and that would make my proportions off. I need to flour my counters. So I'm going to take a handful of flour, and I'm going to flour my counters. A step students often do incorrectly is to add too much flour. So a small amount of flour will do unless your dough is really tacky and you find that you need more. So I'm going to flour my hands, and then I'm going to take my hands and I'm going to pull that biscuit dough out of my bowl. Now I'm going to take and form it into a ball, and I'm going to knead it about 2 or 3 times so that it comes together and it's forming a nice soft dough. Here's another step. A lot of times when people are first learning how to work with dough, they tend to want to overhandle it. So it's sort of fun, it's therapeutic to stand and knead it. The more you knead it, the tougher your dough gets. So I'm going to be careful not to overwork or overhandle my dough. I don't want the shortening to melt until it hits the oven so that I'll end up with a nice tender product. And put it in the center, and I'm going to roll away from me. I'm going to take it and put it back in the center, and I'm going to roll towards me. If you find that it's sticking, you can always roll it in the flour. And I'm going to change my direction, always starting at the center, rolling out, and that's going to ensure an even product. If I were to roll back and forth in the same direction, I would end up with thin parts and thicker parts. Okay, so things I've seen over the years. This is the fun part too. So a lot of students really like to roll out the dough, and they will find as they're doing this that they get a very thin product. These will rise because of the leavening agent in them, but they're not miracle biscuits. So if you roll them to 1/4 of an inch thick and put them in the oven, they're not going to miraculously rise to be 1 inch thick fluffy biscuits. So I'm going to go about 1/2 of an inch or maybe a little bit thicker than that so that when I stick them in the oven and they rise, I have a nice tall biscuit. I also need my biscuit cutter. Okay, if you don't have a biscuit cutter, you can always use a glass. You may want to flour it depending on how soft or tacky your dough is. Use your best geometry and put your biscuit cutter right on the edge and go straight down. You don't want to twist your cookie cutter or your biscuit cutter because that will cause your sides to not rise as properly. That's the word I'm looking for. So take your fingers or a pastry brush, brush off the excess flour, and you're going to put your biscuits on your baking sheet. Now here's a tip. If you like soft biscuits, you're going to put your biscuits very close together because that's not going to allow the air to flow around them, and you're going to have a nice tender soft side. If you like your biscuits to have a little bit of crunch to them or to be crisp on the edges, then you're going to take them and you're going to place them further apart so that the air can flow around, and that will give you your desired results. Brush off excess flour so you don't end up with a dry, powdery biscuit as your final product. You're cutting straight down. You did not need to grease your baking sheet before you started. Now, as far as your scraps go, you take all of your scraps together, you pat them back together, form a ball, and you do the same technique. You take your rolling pin, and you roll out from the center. We're going to cut those last biscuits out straight down. For your final amount, you're going to take your hand and press those together. You want it to be about the same thickness as your other biscuits. being careful if it's too small or too little dough, it may bake faster than your other biscuits, but you want to pat it out to about the same thickness. It's going to go on your pan. Decide how you like your biscuits. And they are ready to go in the oven. So you're going to bake them in a fairly hot oven. Make sure your oven is preheated first, and when they're finished, they're going to come out and they're going to be nice and golden brown. You can always brush them with melted butter to make them have a really nice shine to them. If you're not ready to bake your biscuits, here's a trick. You can take them, cover them with plastic wrap, and stick them in the freezer. Freeze them till they're hard. When they get hard, you can take them and put them in a Ziploc bag, and you can bring them out and bake them as you need them. A lot like the frozen biscuits you buy in the grocery store. So here are our finished biscuits. They have a nice golden brown color, they've risen, and they're ready to eat. So happy baking at your house.